Hi, well, what I'd really like to talk about is this concept of scaling up by using existing communities, networks, and ecosystems in particular. But I want to start with why you should bother to focus on informal learning environments. And there are a number of different arguments. This one has been around for some time. This comes from Phil Bell in the Life Center at University of Washington. But the idea that when you look at the amount of time someone spends in school, there's so much opportunity, right? This is called the sea of blue of informal learning environments there. There's so many different opportunities to try and reach people outside of school. Why not utilize those instead of just focusing on K-12 or through undergraduate or even graduate, and make better use of the time that people spend in other environments? Second reason why I would argue that it's actually very important to work with science centers, science museums, and a number of the informal science learning environments in your community is an issue of trust. And Pew Research Center has quite a few different studies on this, and I'm sure our colleagues in the audience from Pew could talk at length about this. But science centers and museums show up again and again in these studies as highly trusted organizations, right? And we outperform our friends and neighbors in science media, in podcasts, online discussion forums, and even in some instances outperform news agencies themselves. And so they're trusted sources in the community that are already embedded and ready to work with the public. Third reason is this idea of impact. And there are a number of different studies that show this and more research coming on this. But science centers and museums and a lot of informal science organizations, they have a sweet spot of working with children around age, say, 9 to 12. Right? And that's very common for quite a few different kinds of organizations like this. That also happens to be a very formative period for children's identity development. And there are great studies that go on to show, and this is an older one, but there are a number of studies that really talk about the fact that if you can reach a child at that age and get them interested, not only will that science positive attitude continue, but you're more likely to actually see them end up in a science career. And there's a lot of interesting research that shows that interest that's sparked around that critical development period ends up being more influential than household income, more influential than how many AP courses they took, so on and so forth. So there's a real opportunity there to partner. I do want to add this caveat, and that's the power of the family, right? And the parents play a critical role when you put information out there. And I say this as someone who has spent, I'm at 31 years now working in science museums, and you can design all you want. And in fact, this is a good example of a museum exhibit that is poorly designed for family interaction for a long list of reasons. But families will control the learning situation as much as you've done to design it. They will control the situation in emphasizing who's actually interacting with the information, in reinterpreting the information, in connecting it into their own family histories. Many, many times this is very positive. But I've also worked in natural history museums where families come in and use the paleontology exhibits to support their family conversation around creationism. So the power of the family, right, is a caveat that I want to sell informal science organizations as your partner, but I do want to put in the caveat of the power of the family. So let me talk about two existing forms of working with informal science education organizations. Because one of the things I will discourage is going out and trying to make a connection with a single institution. This is a robust field. There's still tons of development happening, but informal science education is a field that now has robust networks and ecosystems well developed, and you will mobilize your work so much faster by working with one of these. And again, it goes back to some of the lifelong and life-wide. But again, when you look at some of these opportunities, networks, for example, right? Let's start with them. You get a number of different things with networks. First of all, they tend to be, in order to get really funded at a significant level, they tend to come in as either a national, international. There are a number that are North American, you'll see around the US here. And they are set up in a way that can help you scale wide, if we're going to think about scaling wide versus scaling deep. If you want to get your message across, and in particular, if you want to make sure that you have a geographic spread, in many instances, these networks can't be funded unless they have that geographic spread, right? So a huge amount of your work is being done already. Another nice thing about networks is that they are groups that in almost every strong network, and I'm going to go through some criteria for what makes a strong network, they've come together purposefully, right? They've been invited in, and they've chosen to accept that invitation because they have a shared value with the rest of the network, they have a strong interest in that particular content, or they have a shared focus on audience, they feel the same urgency. They are together for a reason, and there's a real powerful piece that comes with that. The other thing you get in networks is a lot of boundary organizations. And I know from our conversation already, we have different definitions of what boundary organizations are. But let me say this, if you're working with an informal science education network, you will find organizations who are used to crossing boundaries, either from science research into applied practice, or in many different kinds of ways of reaching the community. So they may be very comfortable in being in after-school environments, moving into the school environment, and so on and so forth. So they're boundary crossers in these groups. The other thing that you find in a network is they are very used to having to prove the worthiness of their existence. They know how to measure themselves, right? And that's something that a lot of us are struggling with all the time. How do we not just scale, but then make sure we're scaling in a way that takes impact up? And if a network is a robust network, they've already had to prove that they can do that. And then the very last thing I would say, and let me scroll through, this is just a list of some of the networks that have really kind of passed the test of what makes a strong network. And I could have listed many others, but these are ones where they've already moved past initial phases into secondary phases. Sometimes they've evolved over time with that, but in most of these instances, there's some hunger, right? They're looking for what the next thing is that they're going to focus on, or the new groups they're going to add in. And so you can really leverage that hunger and find strong partners in that way. These networks have become so omnipresent in our field that now the National Science Foundation, the Association of Science Technology Centers, a number of organizations are now looking at umbrellas across these, network of networks. I kid you not, right? And it's a very exciting thing. In fact, there's a professional group that's just being started to bring together all of those who organize networks. It is important as you're moving into a network collaboration to pause a moment and do a healthy network test. I recommend this one from Inverness Research, but there are many others out there if you do research. And I'll point out a couple sites towards the end. But you should be able to look through and see that it meets these criteria, right? Two-way mechanisms, this is critical. Are they a network that is not just focused on dissemination, but focused on listening to the communities and the audiences they serve, right? Are there multiple ways to participate? Networks that have a lockstep formula are not the networks you want to be part of. Have they codified the governance? How leadership changes over time? All of these things are part of your test. The other kinds of groups that you may look for are ecosystems, and I'm going to talk in particular about STEM ecosystems that are funded by an extraordinary group of funders, more than 20 funders who have gotten together. They're called the STEM Funders Network, and they have very wisely come together to say, look, we can do more if we come together and leverage our funding into deeper and stronger programs. And this in particular has really spread in a wide way in quite a short amount of time. These are all the STEM ecosystems around the US, and you can see there are a few worldwide now that are spreading. What the ecosystem gives you that a network doesn't is they are focused either on a particular city, on a particular region, or on a particular state. They have depth that often the networks cannot exercise in a community. And so for many people working on an urgent community-specific issue, if you have a STEM ecosystem in your community, they will already be deep, very, very deep. This is a good example in Northeast Ohio. We're an area, before I got to Ohio, I was not very familiar with this, but in Ohio, you operate in a region. And so we function as Northeast Ohio. There are a lot of conversations across Northeast Ohio. And one good example here is we outlined everything being done in the region around the maker movement. And one of the things it did through the power of this ecosystem approach is really get people to shift their focus and actually change what their organizations were doing. And you see this again and again in these ecosystems, ecosystems usually require you to leave your ego at the door in a way that a network may not require in the same way. That's because it's a tighter group, it's a deeper group, and so you end up needing to really map out and share the responsibilities for meeting the needs of your community. I can talk a lot about how the ecosystems allow you to really design pathways that are very purposeful in a community, as well as how they help a community prioritize focus. But I want to leave you with two resources. One I would certainly suggest is that you look at stemecosystems.org, and there are multitudes of research on ecosystems, and you can see what different ecosystems across North America and across the world are doing. The other one I would recommend is CASE, and caveat, I mean, you heard in my introduction that I have been part of that organization. Bronwyn is now a PI on CASE, but the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education, you can look on there and see a multitude of these networks. They are out there and they are ready to be your partners in scaling. Thank you.